Before we talk about theories of gender, or one theory specifically related to that comes out of the sociology of gender, I want to introduce you to some important concepts, or I want to define some concepts for us. So this chapter covers the topic of gender and sex. So let's define those terms first. Most often in our society and in everyday life, we use the term sex and gender interchangeably. For instance, on a job application, you might see a box or an area on the application that asks you to select your gender, followed by the words male or female. When we use sex and gender interchangeably, it makes sense, I think, to us in everyday conversation, but technically, it's inaccurate to use the terms interchangeably. When a job application asks you to select your gender, male or female, what they're really asking you about is your biological sex. So the term sex refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of males and females. These most commonly include things like reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones. So technically, sex is a biological grouping based on our anatomy, our chromosomes, levels of hormones, etc. So when sociologists use the term sex, we're referring to our biology or biological characteristics, or the sex that we were assigned at birth. Gender, on the other hand, consists of a set of social arrangements that we build around categories of sex, around the biological categories of sex. Our book defines gender as the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships. So again, the book defines gender as the socially constructed characteristics of men and women, such as norms, roles, and relationships. Gender is different than sex because it relates to the way a person behaves. The idea behind distinguishing between gender and sex is that sex is just something we're born with or assigned at birth. Gender is something we learn. The idea is that we learn how to act manly or womanly. That our society sets expectations for our behavior based on the sex we were born as or the sex we were assigned at birth. I mentioned that the sociology of gender is one of the largest subfields of sociology, and I should correct myself, it is the largest subfield in the field of sociology. Like we've done in previous lessons, we can use theoretical paradigms, the three main theoretical paradigms, to help us organize all of the different research on gender. In this lesson, I'm just going to focus on the symbolic interactionist paradigm as it relates to gender. And we talked about symbolic interactionism earlier in the semester. Remember, symbolic interaction is focused on everyday processes, everyday interactions, everyday experiences in which people create reality or act out their reality. Symbolic interactionist research on gender is influenced by scholars like Erving Goffman. And similar to Goffman's life on a stage metaphor or his theory of dramaturgy, symbolic interactionists view our reality, including the status and the roles were assigned based on our gender, as a social construction. So one famous theory on gender that is directly influenced by Erving Goffman's classical theory is a theory called doing gender by sociologists West and Zimmerman. According to this theory of doing gender, gender isn't something that we are, it's something that we do. Gender, according to West and Zimmerman, is a routine accomplishment embedded in our everyday interaction. The fact that our performances, our gendered performances, are so believable makes gender behaviors and differences based on gender appear natural and effortless. Um, but this theoretical perspective argues that they're not natural, instead that they're performative, that they're social constructions, that they're products of a society or of a culture. Now, gender differences do exist between men and women in terms of the way they dress, in terms of different activities they are involved in, and what men and women say they want. However, sociologists, and specifically sociologists who take the symbolic interactionist approach, suggest that the differences we see between men and women are, again, a social, cultural product, not a fact of nature. If doing gender is a real phenomenon, so if the way West and Zimmerman conceive of gender, that it's not something that we have, that we're born with, it's not natural, but instead it's something that is produced in our everyday interactions. It's something that we perform, it's something that we do. If that is a real phenomenon, then most people in any society should be familiar with the cultural scripts related to gender. To gauge current understandings of gender differences in our culture, I asked students last year in fall 2019 in introduction to sociology classes to create a list of gender stereotypes. These are, I asked them to think of stereotypes for boys and men and girls and women, stereotypes related to the way we're supposed to act or behave, how stereotypes related to aesthetics or the way we're supposed to look, stereotypes related to what men or women are supposed to be good at, sort of naturally talented or gifted at, how men and women are supposed to or typically think, and then what we're supposed to aspire to based on our gender. And I'm going to share some of the results with you. Again, I wanted to see how well just students at Curry understood cultural scripts related to gender. Now, in the end, there was quite a bit of overlap or agreement about stereotypes related to femininity and masculinity. I'm going to show you a word cloud first, and then I'll show you the tally, the list of the results tally. All right, so first, how do we do femininity? How do we do girlhood or womanhood? These are the results in a word cloud form. So in a word cloud, the larger the word, the more frequent it appeared as a response by students. I'll give you a second to take a look at the different words listed in this word cloud. Again, the bigger words were more common, and the smaller words appeared in the list but were less common. Now here's the same survey results. I asked students to tell me stereotypes related to, in this case, femininity, girls and women. And here's that word cloud in a list form. On the column on the far left, you can see stereotypes that were more common, or that there was some more clustering or overlap in responses. The first 8 words, for instance, makeup, cooking, long hair, sweet, feminine, homemaker, motherly, emotional, all had quite a bit of overlap. As you move down the list, there's less agreement, or students, there was less repetition for the words as you go down the list, but still an interesting list here. So that, again, I asked students to produce a list of stereotypes related to girls, women, and femininity. And this is the list that students from Intro to Social last year came up with. I asked the same question related to boyhood, manhood, and masculinity. Same thing. I'll show you the word cloud first, and then I'll show you the um, the list. So here's the word cloud for boys, men, and masculinity. Again, I asked students to come up with a list of stereotypes based on um, uh, cultural norms related to gender, how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to behave, what we're supposed to think and aspire to, what we're supposed to dress like. Now here's the list. Same words that were in the word cloud, but here's the list for boys and men. And again, same pattern. The more repetition, more clustering appears on the column on the left, and then it goes down into less frequently reported words. So again, here now it's the top 7 words: sports, strong, athletic, masculine, insensitive, short hair, breadwinner. All were words that had 10 or more students um, pick those. Now, there's a lot that can be said about these lists, and I would encourage you, as you know are studying for the quiz or reviewing for the final exam, and you look back at this PDF, just take some time thinking about these lists and thinking about whether you agree or disagree with the list. If you had to put a list together, uh, how similar would it be to this, or dissimilar would it be? Also, another thing that I thought was interesting about these lists is that the there seems to be, and there are some ways to kind of count this to get a more accurate measure, but there seems to be more variation in the stereotypes listed for women, and less variation for men. And another way of saying that is, men seem to be, the stereotypes related to men and boys seem to fit a more narrow box, whereas the stereotypes related to women and femininity seem to be a little bit more varied. Now, what's I can go on and talk about those trends some more, but really what's important for our purposes here, really what I wanted to share was how surprised I was with how quickly students put together those lists, and how much overlap and repetition there was in some of the stereotypes. So students put together this list quickly, effortlessly, and what this suggests to me, and what I think this is evidence of, is that we're all taught this stuff. We're all socialized to understand our culture's stereotypical gender roles. Even if you don't, and we talked about roles a couple weeks ago as being both guides and constraints. Even if you don't feel um, like gender stereotypes are particularly fitting, if you feel that they're constraining, if you feel that in some ways society has put you into a box that you don't fit neatly into, you still understand what is expected of boyhood and girlhood, or manhood and womanhood. Like we talked about in last week's, or 2 weeks ago now, the way we learn this stuff, the reason so many of us from all different walks of life can come up with a list of stereotypes and all agree on the stereotypes is because we've all been socialized for the most part, to understand these expectations. And specifically, the agents of socialization that we talked about 2 weeks ago are the people who teach us about gender. As I mentioned in previous lessons, the learning process begins in our family with our parents. Things like gender reveals, it happens really early in life, but eventually all the agents of socialization begin. To, so you get to a point where you're 18 to 22, you're college age. By by the time you get to your stage in life, you all have been properly socialized. And even if you don't fit the gender stereotypes, you know what the gender stereotypes are. The symbolic interactionist paradigm, well, I would say that most sociologists who study gender consider gender a social construct. But especially if we're talking about the symbolic interactionist paradigm, which looks at life at the micro level, if we're thinking about a theory like doing Weston Zimmerman's Doing Gender, these theories are arguing for a social construction of gender kind of logic, which means that which suggests a lot of what we see in society, a lot of the differences we see between men and women are actually not natural. They're not driven by our biology, but are instead a result of socialization processes, a result of social interaction in society. Now, the social construction of gender is is a really important concept, and we talked earlier this semester about the social construction of reality and how that idea kind of ties in with micro levels of analysis and sort of the symbolic interactionist paradigm. But saying that gender is a social construction is often a challenge. It's an assertion that I think is hard to accept for a lot of us. For when it comes to differences between social groups, the differences between men and women are probably the most pervasive and pronounced differences that we see, and they span across cultures, and they go all the way back to ancient times, right? If you open the Bible, it will talk about differences between men and women. Culturally, we have this idea that men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or however the saying goes. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of things that are socially constructed, and I think the notion that our gender is socially constructed is one of the most challenging premises to accept that comes out of sociology, because gender is one of the things that we think is so natural. We think that, you know, again, depending on your worldview, depending on how you've been socialized, gender is probably the most, for most people, they see gender as the most fixed difference between humans, one that's rooted in a real biological sort of need to distinguish between this group over here, what we call males, and this group over here, what we call females. Anyway, the social construction of gender is it's a powerful assertion to argue that sex is biological, gender is social, and so the differences we see are more cultural or social or political than they are natural. But there's two ways, and there's two forms of evidence that you can look at that sort of prove, and there's an abundance of evidence in these two areas that prove that gender is in fact a social construct. And these two areas of evidence are on the slide here. Because gender differences, and this is point number one, because gender differences vary across cultures, that's a sign that we're not dealing with natural human distinctions. And what I mean by that is not only like on the slide here, I have a picture of a man in more of a nurturing or a caregiving role. Not only literally from the United States to other countries does gender roles and gender scripts and gender performances change, but also cultural context. You can think of Goffman's idea of stages. Think about how we do gender differently as we cross different stages in our life, right? Guys, think, how do you do masculinity when you're with your male friends, when you're with your boys, versus how do you perform your gender when you're with your mom? How do you perform your gender if you're with a girlfriend, right? We change the way we behave. We change how closely we adhere to the stereotypes or how willing we are to diverge from them based on the context that we're in. So within one culture, within the United States, there's a lot of different stages where gender can be performed differently. But also when you compare the way we do gender in the United States to the way gender to gender roles and gender norms in other societies, they don't match up. If gender was truly natural, if if what men were supposed to do and what women were supposed to do was set in stone and God ordained, then we would expect to see the same type of gender differences across cultures, and we just don't. So that's one line of argumentation as to why gender is a social construct. The second has to do, and this is in both of these, by the way, when sociologists argue that something is socially constructed, these are two typical lines of argumentation. One, are socially constructed if we see them shift over kind of cross-culturally in different cultural contexts. And we can also say things are socially constructed if they change over time. And so the way that we do gender, the arrangements we have around, uh, for instance, gender roles, what a husband's role is and what a wife's role are, what we expect from men in a society, what we expect from women in a society. If we see changes over time, that's more of an indication that gender is socially constructed, not natural. Um, okay, so I want to end this lesson with uh, sharing an interesting website with you. And this is something that I would encourage you to kind of play around with when you have some time. I think for the sake of time here, I'm not going to click into the website, but I just want to share this with you as an example of sort of a silly example of some evidence we can look at of how gender norms are changing over time. So let me stop the recording, and then I will tell you more about what this website